Now begins the recitation of the Aletheon, the divine avataric self-revelation of His divine presence, Avatar Adi Da Samraj. This is the necessity for a global unity culture to replace the ancient bipolar culture of separate West and separate East. 1. There is something very negative that is implicit in the presumed to be religious perspective of Westerners. From the Western point of view, the question, is there a God, seems to be the necessary preliminary to becoming religious. And of course, the religion chosen is presumed to have successfully answered the question. Nevertheless, the question, is there a God, is an inherently absurd question that has nothing whatsoever to do with real, spiritual, and transcendental, and ultimately really divine life. The question, is there a God, has only to do with human beings themselves, and not at all with the divine. The question, is there a God, reflects a state in human beings for which they must become responsible. In and of itself, the question, is there a God, is not a question that can be answered, nor is it a question that needs to be answered. The religious perspective of Western people is ambivalent. On the one hand, Westerners are very worldly and strong at the life level, insofar as their religion permits worldliness. And, on the other hand, they are phasing, weak, and always threatened at the level of subjective or mental and psychic responsibility. The Western strategy is the attempt to make positive whatever is overwhelmingly negative. People in the West are always trying to overcome what is negative with positive feeling, with beliefs, with effort, with answers, with conditional and materially fixated knowledge. And yet, it is unconscious accumulated patterning of body and mind that is actually shaping the lives of Westerners. Thus, Westerners remain characteristically weak at the deep subjective level and chronically obsessed with an uninspected negative psychological force that is always influencing both their outward behavior and their thinking processes. Therefore, Westerners are always trying to surmount the negative psychological force, either through ego effort or by means of imaginary association with a separate absolute other, whose power they can consume irresponsibly, and in all of that, faith and belief are reduced to the status of methods for overcoming psychological negativity. In the characteristic Western doctrines and in the Middle Eastern teachings that gave rise to them, the negative psychological force that tends to overwhelm people beneath the superficial mind is interpreted as sin, or the failure to achieve success as an ego, and as a problem to be overcome by association with the true belief. If they are already, or as an irreducible matter of principle, presuming a negative position, people tend to orient themselves towards something they feel is positive, something they feel will save them from themselves. Nevertheless, true believers remain chronically sinful or failed cases and are always tending to fall back on the failed condition that is irreducibly present at the ego root of the Western psyche. The fundamental tenet of the great Middle Eastern religions, which, in combination with ancient Greek and Roman modes of philosophical and political thought and idealism, have provided the mythological and conceptual basis for the fabrication of Westernism, is that this world and everything in it, including human beings or separate egos, is, even as a matter of logical necessity, the creation of a causative or creator deity, and that humankind is the highest or final creation, always reflecting, but of course, because of its inherent and irreducible conditionality and separateness, never equaling the deity. Thus, according to the religious-based root doctrine of Westernism, any negative view of this life and this world is, in and of itself, a form of sin or of negative ego behavior, which inherently is a form of guilt. Therefore, according to Western dogma, it is a sin to believe that this world and the separate self or ego I are not God-made, or that a divine plan is not making the destiny of the world and of the individual, or that the world and even all individual fate is not intrinsically and altogether controlled and purposed by the divine. The characteristic Western presumption is that because the world is, or must be believed to be, under the control of the divine, its conditionally apparent or worldly destiny must necessarily be altogether positive, whatever its present condition may be. Therefore, from the Western point of view, to view the world and the separate ego self negatively, and for that reason not to unequivocally embrace and egoically self-identify with the worldly process of conditional happenings, is in and of itself sinful. On the other hand, the characteristic Eastern or Oriental point of view does not unequivocally adhere to the principle that the world and the separate self are the creations of a causative or creator deity, and that the world or all of conditionally apparent existence is, therefore, a divine necessity, requiring the unequivocal embrace of the worldly life and the presumed ego identity that is apparent as the body-mind self. The root principle that is characteristic of the East intrinsically transcends conditionally arising phenomena. The Eastern or Oriental mind is inherently critical of the world itself, not just of the things in the world. From the root perspective of the Eastern mind, the world and the separate ego self are viewed not as the creation of the divine, and therefore as a divine necessity, but as an illusion or a dependent and non-necessary mere appearance, and even as an illusion that is not to be trusted. Thus, according to the root doctrine of the Eastern point of view, the tendency to view this world positively as something that is as itself necessary, and that is in and of itself the purpose of existence, rather than to exercise the will and the discriminative intelligence to transcend the world in that non-conditional condition on which the conditionally arising world and the psychophysical ego self inherently depends, is to be self-deluded and thus swept up in an illusion and a false point of view. Therefore, from the Eastern or Oriental perspective, illusion and not sin is the problem inherently associated with human life. The official disposition promoted in the West is moved toward the world itself, and thus it is oriented to move into the world with a positive will and to struggle against the root psychological tendency to view the world negatively. The official disposition promoted in the East is moved to transcend this world with a world-renouncing will, or otherwise with intrinsically world-transcending discriminative intelligence, and thus it is oriented to struggle with or otherwise tacitly renounce the root psychological tendency to view and thereupon to naively embrace the world merely positively. 2. What can be seen in the outward conflicts on earth today are essentially the artifacts of the two halves, or the two brain sides of humankind, as if the brain's two hemispheres were at war with one another. Nevertheless, humankind is no longer of either the West or the East. Rather, now and forever hereafter, humankind is a global construct or reunion of all. And, therefore, every individual, every brain mind, and every nation and culture must intensively and comprehensively readapt to a unified, rather than a bipolar, global, and necessarily cooperative order. People today may naively try to become associated with the ancient, classical systems of religion, spirituality, and philosophy, yet they do not have the concentration and the undivided mental wholeness necessary for a fully right and comprehensive examination of the concepts, the motives, the religious belief systems, and the esoteric methods that once arose in the bipolar ancient world and psyche. People today generally no longer represent the root archetypal psychological disposition that are at the root of the ancient great cultural enterprises, East and West. Rather, people today, all over the earth, are suffering a double-minded brain confusion of irreducible opposites and unanswered questions. Therefore, unless the root archetypal suppositions, presumptions, and dispositions that anciently divided West from East are actually true of you, such that you are exclusively self-identified with either a Western or an Eastern mind and psyche, you cannot fulfill either the Western program or the Eastern program as they were each originally and separately proposed. If you are truly moved to a right religious life, or otherwise esoteric, spiritual, transcendental, and self-evidently divine life, you have no choice but to completely inspect your condition of existence. That ordeal is the necessity inherent in the confusion of Western-Eastern mind-brain that is the result of the modernization or the universal cultural face-to-face of the present-day globalized society of humankind. Therefore, you must grow to understand and thereupon to practice right religious or otherwise esoteric life in truth. You must become able to differentiate all your casually generated motivations that reflect archaic, conventional, and thus inherently bipolar concepts, persuasions, and philosophies. You have casually inherited your presumed Western or Eastern mind without ever having been a very profound student of it. It all just filtered in through a little bit of culture training, a little bit of parental and social influence. Nevertheless, in order to embrace right religious practice, or otherwise the esoteric way of truth itself and of reality itself, you must, in a truly ego-transcending and difference-transcending manner, become responsible for the religious and altogether human and egoic conventions your patterning represents and would otherwise animate. And you must do this via a sophisticated and intensive investigation of all your mere ideas, however casual or otherwise intensive your inheritance of them may have been. Therefore, in order to serve the course of the ego transcending and difference transcending investigation that is necessary for all of humankind, I have made this book and many other books, wherein and whereby I present a comprehensive system of unique tools that will, if rightly and consistently used, enable that investigation to be truly effective and successful. Here ends the recitation of the Aletheon, the divine avataric self-revelation of his divine presence, Avatar Adida Samraj.